Now on to our interview. From the Philippines to the U.S., news media is increasingly defining the state of politics and, of course, the conduct of elections. Today, an American election speaker and observer of media and politics weighs in on the polls and on polling. Join us in the studio is Professor Alan Schroeder of the School of Journalism at the Northeastern University in Boston. Welcome to Hot Copy here in Head Start, Professor Schroeder.
Thank you.
Professor Schroeder, of course, is also an author of a number of books on media and politics, including this interesting one called 40 Years of High-Risk TV Presidential Debates. I love the way it's said. Presidential debates as high-risk TV. Why so?
Right. Well, high risk for the candidates. It's one of the rare moments when they're out there and they don't have complete control over their message. Because it's live television, you know, because you work in television, that anything can happen in a live television setting. So there's a lot of history in which candidates have had bad experiences, shall we say, and voters have had illuminating experiences just because you don't know what's going to happen. It's a spontaneous moment.
Well, that's something we can understand from our own experience with presidential debates in the Philippines. But let's take a look at this. On one hand, it's important to have debates because this informs the public on the stands and issues which candidates carry with them in the campaign, and whoever wins, of course, will be implementing these policies. On the other hand, this favors those who are media savvy. I mean, how do you balance both?
Well, I think the reality in our modern era is that part of being a national leader is the ability to communicate a message. And the way they do that is via television. So as you look at the requirements for a president of any country, one of the things is being able to talk to the people.
It's no excuse now to say that, oh, I'm the best candidate, but just too bad I'm not a good communicator.
Yeah,
it comes
exactly.
with the job.
It comes with the job. It's like me as a professor saying, I love to lecture, but I don't want to grade papers. So, you know, you have to be able to do a little bit of everything here, and I think most candidates have begun to understand that, and if you're resistant to that or you're unwilling to go there, it's going to reflect very badly on you.
Okay, there's a difference between a good communicator, which is a requirement of any effective leadership, and there's someone who is just really good at entertaining the public through television. I mean, how do you make sure that a debate brings out a meaningful discussion rather than pure entertainment, which is what happens now, and you see it sometimes in Republican debates, for example.
Sure. Donald Trump being a classic example of exactly what you're describing here. Well, you know, it's an interesting question, and it is a problem inherent to debates because
the structure of debates.
The structure of debates, yeah, you're sort of packaging substance within an entertainment framework. So I think the media, the journalists, have a job to do here in the analysis of the debates. If somebody comes out there and just jokes around or attacks his opponents or, you know, sort of insults his way through the event, then I think in the analysis of that, in the descriptions of what happened, that has to be pointed out. I would also give credit to voters, that I think voters are pretty sophisticated about understanding when that is what is happening. I mean, people like being entertained, but on some level they need information, and they don't want somebody who's just, you know, a clown who has no concrete proposals.
But the mere term debate already implies there's going to be some kind of fireworks that's going to happen on stage. And that in itself, I think, is problematic in a way, isn't it?
Could be. You know, back when the original debates took place, Kennedy and Nixon in 1960, the networks that put the debates on did not want to use the word debate. They called them discussions. And so
you couldn't do that today. No one's going to tune in when you say we're going to have an ANC discussion. It's got to be a debate.
It's got to be a debate. I mean, discussion sounds too civilized, but let's face it.
But it should be civilized. I mean, why should a debate be a bloody discussion among candidates? I mean, this is a democracy. We want to settle things, you know, in the most civilized manner as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think it has to be bloody, but it is a competition. I mean, let's be honest. Only one person wins the election, right? So you're setting it up as a competitive event because the election itself is a competitive event. And the other thing is they don't agree with each other or they wouldn't all be running for office. So there is inherent conflict built into the debate structure. So I understand that it isn't a precise term, but I think it's a term that nowadays especially we can understand.
And what is the responsibility of the debate moderator? I mean, is it to precisely draw the blood or because that would bring in the ratings perhaps, and that's what people will be looking for.
Right.
Or how would you describe the responsibility of the, whether it's the moderator or the organizer of the debate?
Yeah, very interesting question, and I think it's a very difficult role because the
that
moderator
person frames the discussion in a way.
Absolutely.
Not the candidates. It's the moderator, it's the questions, it's the network or the organization that mounts the debate.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so there's a lot of responsibility that goes with being a moderator. I know, for instance, in the upcoming debates here in the Philippines, you have 3 different versions of who asks the questions. You have 2 journalists, a double moderator situation. You have a press panel, a group of journalists asking questions, and then you have a town hall in which citizens ask questions. And so I think in each of those setups, you're going to get a kind of a different feel. And that's a good thing, to have that variety of formats and that variety of opportunities.
So going back to the question, on one hand, the responsibility of the journalist, because he's got 2 things he has to consider. One, it's got to be interesting enough so that people watch and therefore are informed about the issues, about the platforms, the candidates. On the other hand, he also doesn't want to, turn it into some kind of brawl, and therefore it dumbs down the whole discussion.
Right.
So how do you, if you're a journalist, help us navigate this minefield that he faces in a national debate such as this?
Well, I think the first thing is the moderator has to know the issues inside and out. Okay. So if a candidate says something that is simply ridiculous or can't
call him out.
Yeah, he can call him out. And yet, on the other hand, the debate should not become a fight between the moderator and the candidates. It really has to focus,
in some debates.
As we've seen in some debates, it has to focus on the candidates. So I think the good moderators are those who know how to step back and not make it be about themselves, but keep the focus on the candidates, yet understand that the candidates are going to try to get away with a lot of different things, and there may be a moment where you have to sort of rein them back in a little bit.
So as we speak, the networks, the TV networks, the Commission on Elections, we're organizing these presidential debates in the upcoming months. What would you say, based on best practices, not just in the U.S., because you've observed the debates and elections in other parts of the world, what would be an ideal format to bring out, number one, the basic need for information, number 2, where candidates can be differentiated, and third, it should be interesting enough so that people tune in and not like tune into something else, like a soap opera at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the key is the element of surprise. That I think a good moderator, a good set of questioners are the ones who take the candidates off their sound bites, who surprise them a little bit, or throw something at them that they haven't quite expected, because that's when we really get to see what these candidates are able to do, how they think on their feet, how they handle a kind of unforeseen event. Because being president means you're dealing with a lot of things in real time and a lot of unexpected events, and so a debate gives us a little insight into how that person reacts in a spontaneous way.
Get them
off script. Absolutely.
So, getting them off script, of course, would be great, because then you see how they would respond in times of national emergency, for example, rather than some memorized line given to them by their speechwriters. On the other hand, these candidates, they also have to present themselves to the public as people that can be trusted.
Right.
Okay. This brings us back to the debate. Is it more important about what you say in terms of policy, or is it more important about how you say it in public, how you conduct yourself? Talking about the nonverbal language of debates.
Right. I actually think both things have equal importance, although we tend to focus more on the style. But if you're all style and no substance, you've got a problem. If you're all substance and no style, you have a different problem. So the candidates have to be able to navigate that conflicting set of objectives. And yet, the good ones do sort of figure that out.
President Obama, I think, is a good example of that.
President Obama is a good example of that. I think one of the best we ever had in the U.S. was Bill Clinton, who was a great performer and who really enjoyed being up there. And that word enjoy, by the way, I want to come back to that, because I think sometimes...
That sounds a bit scary when you say enjoyed. We're not supposed to enjoy our candidates and their performance.
But yet the ones who do enjoy it, you can tell they enjoy it. And I think for the voters and for the viewers, there's something that they like about that.
And it can't be faked, you think? TV is a very unforgiving medium, right?
Right. One of the writers after the Kennedy-Nixon debate referred to television as a truth machine because that camera gets up in your face and you can't lie your way through a live event, especially over the course of an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours, however long the thing runs.
Well, let me use that and throw this back at you and say, then why then is Donald Trump doing so well in debates and doing well in the polls, if indeed it looks like he's just kind of just having fun there and not really taking it seriously?
Well, I think we have to remember that it's early in the process, that although Donald Trump has a lot of support, it's a pretty narrow support. It's a support within the Republican Party. He's one of 15 or so candidates right now. So yes, he's ahead, but there's a lot of other, there are a lot of other favorites within that group. And then you'll get him into a general election situation where that support goes down even more so. And I would point out, I don't think he's done that well in the debates. He likes being there by himself on a stage without the other people. In the debates, he kind of just hangs back and waits for his turn to be called because he doesn't like sharing the spotlight.
So the debate actually hurts him more than just actually doing the usual speeches from town to town.
It does, because for one thing, when he's asked a substantive question, he really, you can see that he hasn't really thought about it very much, whereas the more traditional candidates are able to articulate
I brought up Donald
better
Trump
answers.
because a lot of candidates today are now using him some kind of template.
Yeah.
We want to do a Donald Trump.
Right.
Even in the Philippines, you have candidates who are saying, I want to go rogue.
Right,
okay,
Mr.
because
Duterte.
People are looking for that. People
Yes.
want this raw,
Yeah.
so-called authentic
Yeah.
quality in their candidates.
Right.
Do you think that that's going to be the new normal in politics?
I sort of hope not, because I like
The outsider, the rogue, the
Yeah.
guy who mocks the system.
Yeah, and there's definitely room to shake up traditional politics. Don't get me wrong. Politics certainly deserves to be shaken up from time to time. But if everybody goes rogue, then it's just an anarchy. You can't really have positive results if everybody is just sort of saying whatever they think. Politics also has to be about thoughtfulness, and it has to be about looking forward into the future and knowledge of the issues. So it may be entertaining to have these candidates, but I think we have to be a little cautious about that.
Speaking of being cautious, let's go back to the role of journalists in covering an election campaign. When you do have these so-called star candidates like Donald Trump, I mean, it's definitely to his advantage to do that, because then he's attracting media attention. I mean, again, he wouldn't be who he was in the polls, where he was in the polls right now, if not for all the media attention. So he's understanding and he's manipulating the media rather than the other way around, the media putting him in his place.
Yes, and that's our fault as as members of the media and as journalists.
And here in the Philippines, you have a similar problem where you just go to the most controversial candidate, the controversial candidate who says a controversial thing, whether he's saying it out of pure out of jest or maybe just trying to manipulate the news, gets all the attention.
Right.
And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. He gets the attention, his numbers rise in the polls.
But here's the thing. I think you have to provide additional context. Yes, you want to hear what they have to say, and not only because it's entertaining, but because they may be elected president. So what they have to say is of interest. But the role of the journalist then is to put those comments into a broader context. What has the candidate said previously? So in the case of Trump, for instance, you compare what he says now, he was saying something totally different a few years ago. So it's interesting then for the audience to realize, well, maybe this guy doesn't really believe the thing that he's saying now.
How familiar are you with our local elections here?
Well,
right now?
not as familiar as I should be, probably. I've only been here for a few days, but I have, sort of an overview of some of the candidates here.
What would you say so far?
Well, I think, we were talking about Trump. I think, with Mr. Duterte, you have a kind of an interesting parallel here. This idea of a straight talker, someone who's a colorful figure, someone who does not censor himself. And from what I'm hearing, just talking to voters, is that there is a lot of appeal to that. So I think there's that. I think you have an interesting parallel on the citizenship question with Grace Poe versus Ted Cruz in the United States. Her problem, is her residency, one of her issues, and his problem is he was not born in the United States. So
and then you have the mainstream candidates, the two others, Jojo Binay and Mar Rojas, who represent the political system. Similarities as well with some of the more mainstream politicians in in the U.S.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, it isn't just the U.S. and the Philippines. Around the world, the last couple of years, we've seen elections that have broken all the rules.
You're seeing the rise of outsiders. Let's go back to the responsibility of journalists. And apart from debates, and thank you for explaining that to us, let's talk about surveys, or in the U.S. you call it polling.
Right.
Okay? There's a new survey, the results at least of every new survey is met with a lot of media attention.
Right.
And for better or for worse, okay? But there's always a tendency to treat the elections as a horse race. I mean, is that similar in the U.S.? How do journalists treat survey results?
A horse race, absolutely. That's exactly the term. And there's nothing wrong with opinion polls as part of the election coverage, but if that drives the election coverage, if that becomes the dominant factor in how the campaign is covered, then that's a problem. Because what you're not reporting then are where they stand on issues, what are their policies, what would they do if they were elected.
But it makes for interesting TV, doesn't it?
Oh, sure, absolutely. And it's also human nature. We all want to know, you know, it's like watching a game. You want that score displayed on the screen so you can kind of keep track of who's where.
Well, you use the word sports, and unfortunately, that's exactly how a lot of journalists cover elections. I mean, there are pitfalls to that. It's entertaining, it's compelling, but what are the pitfalls for democracy of covering elections like as if it were a basketball game or a boxing match or, as I said, a horse race?
Well, because obviously a sporting event, an athletic event, does not carry the consequences of an election. Although there are some similarities. I mean, there's structural similarities. There's that outcome similarity. Somebody wins, somebody loses. So we can all understand.
There's even the post-game analysis,
There's the post-game
analysis,
the pre-game analysis. Yeah. So there are certain parallels. But, you know, at the end of the day, who wins the basketball game does not matter, obviously, nearly as much as who wins the election.
So how should journalists cover survey results? Because some candidates have criticized the news media for putting too much emphasis on it, and therefore, and they would use the term conditioning the minds of voters. Oh, this is the front runner.
Right.
Oh, this candidate will never make it because he's at the bottom of the surveys, and more often than not, there is that, again, is the word self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes, and of course the job of the media should be to tell the story, not to shape the story. And so one of the problems with covering polls excessively is that you're declaring winners and losers well before the voters have had a chance to chime in. But the polls also do reflect the mood of the voters. So the voters are having some voice in that conversation. I think with polls too, you need to be very transparent about how many people did we talk to. Were they people who already supported different candidates? You know, give the information about the poll. What was the sample like? Over what period of time were the questions asked? What was the wording of the questions? All of that stuff is important for us to really understand what's going on with polls.
It's also important that journalists understand the whole polling process.
It sure is. It sure is. And a lot of journalists, let's face it, are not numbers people necessarily. And so journalists, I think, are sometimes too quick just to look at the numbers and jump to conclusions. But really, a poll is a snapshot. It's a particular moment in time, and it may be relevant this week, but next week something completely different could change the conversation.
All right. Let's talk about transparency. You brought up the word transparency. We of course ask that of our politicians. Transparency in the way they run their campaigns. What about transparency in media and transparency among journalists when covering the news? I mean, talking about bias, talking about conflict of interest, vested interest. I mean, should there be some kind of disclosure system in covering an election?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it would be difficult to disclose because what exactly would you be disclosing and how would you disclose it? But, you know, if a news outlet is particularly partisan and blatantly so, I think that might be pretty apparent in its coverage. But on the other hand, maybe the other media, the more neutral media, have a role to play here in pointing out.
You're talking about, for example, CNN versus Fox. Okay?
Exactly.
One clearly identified as taking a more liberal view, the other being more conservative, perhaps even Republican view. We don't have that in the Philippines. Okay, every news organization will say it's nonpartisan, and we are ideally nonpartisan. But I mean, how do we check bias at the door?
It's very difficult because, you know, reporters are human beings and we all bring our experiences, our biases, our preferences to what we report. But I do think for journalists particularly that a very basic requirement of the job is being able to step back and put some distance between your own
Regardless
beliefs.
of your personal beliefs.
Regardless of your personal beliefs, that you have got to be able to tell that story in a way that does not reflect your personal biases. And the best way to do that is to simply be accurate in your reporting. If you're fair and you're accurate and you don't allow opinion to creep into your text or your writing or your speaking, then that's the best evidence that you are reporting it in a fair way.
Right. That's a conscious process for a journalist to check his own biases and you know, political leanings. However, sometimes journalists are unwittingly manipulated by spin doctors and campaign communications specialists. I mean, the tendency for a lot of election coverage is to fall for the narratives that are peddled by these campaign teams. And we just repeat it, and when you repeat it over and over again, in a way it becomes like a fact or truth to the public. How not to fall into that trap?
Well, I think one way is to always attribute the source of your information. If you're saying that something is a particular narrative, say, according to the advisors
when I say narrative, I mean the kind of image that these candidates want to project.
Right.
Not just a story they're trying to sell, but the kind of image, the kind of personality they're trying to project. Oh, he's a reformer. Oh, he's the controversial guy. Oh, he's the straight talker. Sometimes these are just manipulated by PR experts.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think part of it is that use of particular language. Be very careful when you apply labels to candidates, especially one or two words that reduce a complex human being or a complex candidate into, you know, just a very narrow little window of description there. So I think that's part of it, is be conscious as a reporter that that's what you're doing and try to avoid those easy labels and think in a more complex way about what is this person really about.
In one of the other books that you authored, I like the way it was called, Celebrity in Chief, like the entertainer in chief. How has show business infected, not even affected politics, but infected politics? You have that in the U.S., and surely you have that here.
Yeah, I do notice that this seems to be a very theatrical culture in general, and certainly
nothing wrong with that in particular, right? But how does it affect politics?
Not at all. Well, it affects politics because it requires of candidates, and this is back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, it requires an ability to communicate your message through the various media and to be interesting. It requires you to be interesting. If you bore, and Richard Nixon said this back in 1960, the most important thing is not to bore the audience. And
well, he was one to speak. I mean,
well, I know
he
did
a bad job during the Nixon-Kennedy debate.
But I think that's why he figured that out, you know, because there is this thing that happens, you know, especially with candidates who are on television night after night after night, is you have to keep refreshing the
machine.
Yeah, your machine.
Feeding the machine with stories.
Feed the machine with stories, that's right. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that as long as there's substance to back it up. But, you know, you think about candidates and how they do their jobs these days. They have advisors for speech, they have advisors for how they look, for how they dress,
what color of tie to wear,
what colors to wear,
body
language.
Is that inherently wrong? I mean, has the showbizification of politics dumbed down our politics? Has it shallowed out our politics?
Well,
because it is basically a reality we can't avoid at this point. It's the age of communication, and if you can't communicate, if you can't stand out above the noise, I mean, that's the end of your career.
Yeah, it certainly can be, and it certainly puts extra pressure on the candidates and the politicians to be able to do that. But it's only one little tool in their toolbox, and I think that's where we have to really look at this. It's a question of proportion. How much of that are they about, as opposed to, are they really intelligent? Do they really know anything? Do they really care about the needs of the voters? So they got to be able to do it, but if that's all they can do, I'm thinking back to Sarah Palin, very effective on television.
But she didn't win.
But didn't win because nothing happening up here. So you have to be able to really communicate a message, but beyond that, you have to have a message to communicate.
And would you say that voters, no matter what we say about voters do know?
I think they do. I think they do instinctively. But again, part of our job as journalists is to help them arrive at those conclusions, to help them see through the inconsistencies and the spin and the attempts to manipulate. So that's part of what we do, and that's our role in this conversation.
Very interesting discussion. We hope you could come back soon and observe our elections and tell us perhaps your insights.
Yeah, I'll be watching from afar.
All right, Professor Alan Schroeder, thank you so much.
Thank you, David. My pleasure.